For Janis Joplin, buying a sports car wasn't about speed, and it wasn't about prestige. For the screaming queen of rock and roll blues, buying a Porsche was about having fun and looking good. This is the story of how a used off-white set of wheels became a one-of-a-kind flamboyant trademark for a psychedelic age. It's Janis Joplin's Technicolor 356 Cabriolet Porsche. Janis Joplin left her hometown of Port Arthur, Texas for San Francisco in 1960. She was just 17. Joplin was determined to become a successful singer. Her first effort, a career in folk music, failed to catch fire. Then, in 1966, she joined up with a San Francisco rock group called Big Brother and the Holding Company. Her gravelly blues voice and the band's tough sound combined to make an almost instant success. Janis became known as a rock and roll diva who wasn't afraid to speak her mind.
She sort of, summed up everything that, that period of the 60s was about, sort of, being wild and free and all that, and, and talking about sex and all those sorts of things. I mean, she really was the first female performer in the rock and roll world to sort of take on that persona.
Janis recorded 2 albums with Big Brother and the Holding Company before striking out on her own in 1968. Janis had arrived, but she hadn't really arrived in style.
She was driving a car that she had broken the key off in the lock to get into it, and she had to hot wire it to drive it around, and she had to park it on a hill because to go downhill and pop the clutch.
In September of 1968, Janis visited a Los Angeles car dealership on Santa Monica Boulevard. There, she plunked down $3,500 cash for a 3-year-old oyster white Porsche 356C Cabriolet.
That model of Porsche was very desirable at that time. It was like groovy and kind of antique, and so she bought it in that spirit, I'm sure, even though she could have afforded anything.
The Porsche was one of only about 3,000 of its model ever built. It had a 4-speed transmission and a black padded convertible top. A gem of a car, except that Janis didn't like its off-white color. About the same time, a friend named David Richards painted a custom design on her boyfriend's motorcycle. Joplin asked Richards if he could paint her car, too. She offered no specific guidelines. She just wanted a car that matched the times. And she got it. Butterflies and jellyfish swirl around God's all-seeing eye on the hood. Membranes, mountains, and birds splash across one side of the car. On the car's left front fender, a montage of Janis and her Big Brother bandmates. And on the right side, dreamy images of planets and stars. Richards called his creation History of the Universe.
It's almost organic. It kind of melts into the road. It's a beautiful, it's almost like one of those, like a lichen that grows on a rock or something. It's so smooth. It seems like the product of millions of years of evolution.
Joplin loved the paint job, but not everyone was so enthusiastic.
The dealer that she bought it from was like appalled by the fact that she had given it this paint job. I mean, it's, if it would maybe be one thing if it was a, Mustang or a Ford Falcon or something like that from that period.
Joplin's wigged-out rolling rainbow caused a scene on the road, too. Whether she was at home in San Francisco or recording in L.A., pedestrians instantly recognized Joplin by her psychedelic Porsche. Fans left notes under her windshield or simply screamed and waved as she drove by.
One night, Janis played in San Rafael, California, at a really insane place with a lot of Hell's Angels. On the ride home, Janis was driving, and Chris Christopherson and I were sharing this very small seat. Then there were people by the side, I remember by the sides of the streets, and they were kind of waving. It was like a royal progress through the streets.
The car was even more popular than the singer might have liked. In the spring of 1969, the Porsche was stolen while she performed at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. But it seems the thief was torn between disguising the car and preserving the outlandish paint job. Maybe he was a Joplin fan.
And the guy that stole it, he painted part of the car, covered it with, I think, a gray paint, but he did the back of it because he figured that way that if the police were following him, they wouldn't know that was the psychedelic car. You know, he didn't realize you maybe have to paint the whole thing.
Thanks to the half disguise, the police picked up the car a week later in an Oakland parking lot. The gray primer was easily removed, and the car was returned. But Joplin's car cruising days were numbered. On October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin was found dead of a heroin overdose in a Hollywood motel. After Joplin died, the Porsche was given to Joplin's manager, Albert Grossman. He drove the car at his home in upstate New York for 3 years, frequently lending it to visiting friends and family. But in 1973, the Joplin family asked to have the Porsche back. Janis's younger brother, Michael, set out for upstate New York to retrieve it. He was surprised by what he found.
He told me it was in great shape, running fabulous, and so I flew out with my wife, and we were going to drive it home, and, you know, it was cool. It was a Porsche, you know, and we got there, and the engine was seized. It was totally trashed, full of beer bottles, and just, you know, all 4 tires flat, and brakes were shot, you know. I'm like, oh, thanks.
With a few repairs, Michael managed to get the car home. But by now, it was almost 10 years old, and parts were increasingly hard to find. Michael and his sister Laura frequented junkyards and searched nationwide for parts. And then, the famous clash of colors began to chip.
I would be driving along, and these big chunks of paint would fly off as, you know, this is not okay. And at the time, Janis had not become the icon that she is today. And so I get, well, let's opt for the car. This is a really cool car. It's a collectible car itself. And so we stripped it and got it painted.
Janis's Porsche was once again painted gray, this time back and front, in order to preserve the original metalwork. The trick worked, so Michael and his sister kept driving.
For a long time, my sister and I would just share it. You know, you get it for 2 years, and I get it for 2 years. You know, she had it in Denver in the ice and snow, and I had it in Arizona in the desert, and so I went through some trauma.
Finally, the cost and effort to maintain the Porsche proved too much. In 1985, it was permanently parked and covered at Michael's Arizona home. Meanwhile, Laura Joplin was preserving Janis's legend in words. Laura wrote Love, Janis, a book she turned into a play about Janis's brief, wild ride through life. When the play opened in Denver, the Joplins had the old Porsche restored for a lobby display. David Richards' psychedelic paint job was painstakingly recreated by the theater's art department. But the Porsche still doesn't run, and the odometer rests at 138,512 miles, several thousand of which were clocked by one of rock and roll's greatest stars and one of San Francisco's most passionate drivers. In 1995, the Joplin family loaned Janis Joplin's Porsche to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, where it still sits on public display.